U.S. and Soviet Union had a conflict which started when the U.S. installed missiles in Turkey, making the Soviets feel threatened and installed missiles in Cuba in return. Between October 16 through October 28, many events happened that could have ended in a nuclear war. Before tensions could grow any tighter, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev compromised with U.S. President John F. Kennedy by making a deal that if we take our missiles out of Turkey, the Soviet Union will take their missiles out of Cuba. The overall cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Cold War conflict between the U.S. and Soviet Union. There are other reasons such as the Bay of Pigs, but they all stem from this cause. Major events that occurred in the Cold War which sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Berlin Wall, which was built on August 13th, 1961, and the Bay of Pigs, which happened on April 15th, 1961.
It was a battle between capitalism and communism. Complete government control versus free enterprise. Communism wasn't just spreading in the East, it was spreading in the West in Cuba. Cuban dictator Fidel Castro came to power in 1959 after overthrowing Prime Minister Batista in a military rebellion. There were several attempts to get rid of Castro, but they all failed, most notably the Bay of Pigs.
The first mishap of the Bay of Pigs occurred on April 15, 1961, when 8 bombers left Nicaragua to bomb Cuban airfields. The CIA had used obsolete World War II B-26 bombers and painted them to look like Cuban Air Force planes. The bombers missed many of their targets and left most of Castro's Air Force intact. As news broke of the attack, photos of repainted U.S. planes became public and revealed American support for the invasion. President Kennedy had to cancel a second airstrike. On April 17th, the Cuban exile invasion force known as Brigade 2506 landed at beaches along the Bay of Pigs and immediately came under heavy fire. Cuban planes strafed the invaders, sank 2 escort ships, and destroyed half of the exiles' air support. Bad weather hampered the ground force, which had to work with soggy equipment and insufficient ammunition.
The Berlin Wall began on August 13, 1961. The communist government of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, began to build a barbed wire and concrete anti-fascist bulwark between East and West Berlin. The official purpose of this Berlin Wall was to keep Western fascists from entering East Germany and undermining the socialist state, but it primarily served the objective of stemming mass defections from East to West. The Berlin Wall stood until November 9, 1989.
We got to interview Jim Moore, who was stationed at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho, which housed numerous bombers and tankers during the time of the crisis. They were on high alert. We were very fortunate to get this interview.
Russia knew that we had these missiles in Turkey, and they knew that we had intercontinental missiles, which they didn't think was quite ready. So anyway, they decided that since we had these short-range missiles in Turkey, they would put some short-range missiles in Cuba.
Tuesday, October 16, 1962. President Kennedy is informed that the Cubans are holding Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles in Cuba, or ICBMs for short.
We couldn't handle that because a missile sitting in Cuba, even a missile of that size, could hit St. Louis.
He's showing pictures taken a day before by a U-2 spy plane that flew over the Cuban build site. President Kennedy convenes his executive committee to consider America's options. After several hours of debating, President Kennedy opted to take the diplomatic approach.
On Thursday, October 18th, President John F. Kennedy met with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and advises him that America will not tolerate Soviet missiles in Cuba, but Gromyko denies Soviet weaponry in Cuba.
That statement also was false.
The next day, President Kennedy meets with the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as they discuss their military options.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Sunday, October 21st, after several more days of discussion, President Kennedy decides on naval blockade of Cuba.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The blockade was used to block Russian freighters from entering and resupplying Cuba. We also got to interview Ivan Jocelyn, who was a naval commander at the time of the crisis.
Them putting any live missiles down there and missile launchers in Havana, and the United States had told the Soviet Union, don't you send any more of those components down out of Havana, because if you send missile components and we know that they go on board, we're going to sink the ship that has it.
Have set up they didn't call it a blockade, because a blockade is an act of war. They called it a quarantine.
Thursday, October 25th, several more days in getting support from the OAS to quarantine Cuba, the U.S. ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, confronts the Soviets at the UN, but they refuse to answer, where Stevenson then gives his most famous quote.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
During a surveillance mission on October 27, Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba in his U-2 spy plane.
He was the only man killed in action by enemy fire during the crisis. After his death, President Kennedy awarded him with the Air Force Cross, as well as the Air Force Distinguished Medal, the Purple Heart, and the Chinese Award. October 28th, the crisis comes to a close when Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev writes a letter to President Kennedy, stating that they will take out all their ICBMs from Cuba if the U.S. takes out all their missiles from Turkey.
We put in what they call a medium missile. I don't want to say intercontinental. It wasn't an intercontinental missile. It was a short-range missile, 1,200 miles, something like that. We put them in Turkey.
President Kennedy agreed to the compromise. He would later follow up with his promise by taking them out 9 months later. Several short-term and long-term effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The short-term effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that people were relieved that there was no nuclear cataclysm.
Also, most schools had their students perform drills, including hiding under their desks, in case worst came to worst and Castro fired upon the U.S.
The long-term effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the tensions between us and Russia did not change, as the Cold War lasted for almost 3 more decades. We did not trust the Russians during the Cold War, and we still don't trust them till this day.
If war did break out, people would have to hide in bunkers such as this one in order to stay alive.
Cuban Missile Crisis. Your personal opinion.
I'm scared.
Okay. What was your point of view on the Cuban Missile Crisis?
My point of view was that I was ready to pull the trigger.
The crisis not only affected the United States, but also affected Russia, mostly in that the Russian people questioned Khrushchev's leadership skills because they believe he abandoned them and Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major conflict that could have ended in nuclear war if a compromise was not made. The Cuban Missile Crisis was overshadowed by many events occurring at this time, including the Bay of Pigs.
It would have been a nuclear cataclysm, which would have had a worldwide ripple effect, affecting every nation not only just physically, but also economically, spiritually, and emotionally.
If the Cuban Missile Crisis never came to a compromise, then it would have forced the U.S. and the USSR to go into World War III. This would have not only affected us, but other countries, including U.S. and USSR allies. We can take what we learned about the Cuban Missile Crisis and apply it to today. As Teddy Roosevelt once said, "The more you know about the past, the better prepared you are for the future." All in all, the Cuban Missile Crisis conflict was the closest the world had ever come to all-out nuclear war. Thanks to a last-minute compromise between President John F. Kennedy and Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev, mankind was saved from all-out nuclear destruction.
The effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been drastic, as history would have been made of another great war, followed by the millions of deceased families and soldiers.